Does the Bible allow divorce in the case of adultery, even if the adulterer is broken and repentant and seeking reconciliation? I don't think so. I don't think the Bible allows divorce and remarriage ever while the spouse is living. That's my radical, crazy, conservative, narrow, hard-nosed, very needed view in our divorce-happy culture. Does the Bible allow divorce in the case of adultery, even if the adulterer is broken? Now, I suppose behind this question is Matthew 5:32 and Matthew 19:9. Those are the two exception clauses in the New Testament. If a man divorces a woman except for, and the Greek word is porneia, if a man divorces a woman except for porneia and marries another, he makes her commit adultery. So the question, this person, I assume, is taking the except clause. It's sometimes translated except for unchastity, except for immorality. Porneia means most naturally fornication, which is why I have this bizarre interpretation that very few people follow, that it relates to fornication, that is, sex prior to marriage. In other words, Jesus is not saying when he forbids divorce and remarriage that a sexual sin before marriage should keep you from marrying. And he did that because Joseph and Mary were in that situation in Matthew, and that's where these exception clauses occur. At least Joseph thought she was in that situation. So he's going to put her away and not marry her because he was a just man and didn't want to marry. And Jesus is saying, I don't have that situation in mind when I forbid divorce. So I don't think there is an exception for adultery in the New Testament, which means that especially if the adulterer were repentant, which is what this question is saying, does the Bible allow divorce in the case of adultery even if the adulterer is broken and repentant? And I suppose my main argument here, just leave aside all the disagreement with what I just said, because most everybody disagrees with me on those. Go to Ephesians 5 and say, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. Well, has the church ever committed adultery? Like daily? So how a Christian husband can say to a penitent adultery committing wife, a penitent, you did it, and that breaks it, and it's over, and so I'm going to officialize it at the court. I don't see how any Christian husband can talk that way, can feel that way toward a broken and repentant. And I think even if she isn't broken and repentant, he should wait and pray and pray. That is a hard teaching. And marriage, just throw out a little thing here. I read a book one time by Jeffrey Bromley called God and Marriage, about 120 pages. God and Marriage. And it's just God, the Trinitarian God in the Old Testament and marriage, the Trinitarian God in the New Testament and marriage. And he pointed out something. He said, in the Old Testament, every marriage is a rotten marriage. They're all painful. He just took every patriarch, just so horrible they were. You got polygamy involved. You got Hagar, concubines involved. You got, every marriage you look at in the Old Testament is horrible. Hosea. And there is no divorce anywhere in the Old Testament among patriarchs. They all endured. They all gutted it out. It was just a mess. It was just horrible. And God ultimately never divorces his people. There are separations. She goes into exile in Babylon. And you get divorce-type language. You got to be careful in Jeremiah when it says he gave her a bill of divorcement. Not really. He sent her away, and then he went and said, my heart grows warm for you. I'm taking you back. And then Hosea illustrates that by go marry a prostitute. It was really quite powerful for me at a certain stage in my marriage to hear Bromley point out with illustration after illustration how many bad marriages there were in the Old Testament and how none of them ended in divorce. Your view on divorce and remarriage is narrower than many other Christians, even in your church. How does this affect your ministry to them? Well, that's true, and it might be good to just clarify what that means. My understanding is that Christ's ideal for marriage is one man, one woman, in covenant, as long as they both shall live, so that if a divorce happens, that does not free a person to remarry as long as the spouse is living. That's a very minority view. It's not one that is shared by, I suppose, a lot of Christians, but that's where I am. It's my understanding of all the texts in the Gospels, as well as Jesus as well as Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 and 7, Romans 7. The way it affects my people is that I preached a series of messages on marriage, and 2 of them were on this issue. And I simply looked them right in the eye and I said, we as a church do not have one mind on this. Not even the leaders, the elders do not have one mind on this. What do? You cannot in a church discipline people single-handedly. That's not what church discipline is. Church discipline is when the church acts. So if a church doesn't have a mind on something, it can't act. It can't put somebody out of the church for an act that the church is divided in half or over. So we have to find who we are as a church. And so what we did was we came up with a statement that I and all the elders could agree on. We would go as far biblically as we could find one mind together, and then that functions as the way we hold each other accountable. Now, emotionally, it's awkward. It is. And yet I have been so thankful that given how much we share in common with each other at deeper, bigger, stronger, eternal levels, even people, divorced people, who know I disapprove of what they did can relate to me and I to them, because my position is that once you have entered a marriage you shouldn't have entered, God can redeem it. I mean, there are many people who are in marriages that they themselves would say, I shouldn't have entered. Might have married an unbeliever, for example, and now she's a believer, but divorce would be one, that would be another. And they know it shouldn't have happened, and yet given the nature of grace and God's ability to redeem something, there's so many places in the Bible where he redeems things that shouldn't have been and uses them for his glory, that they know that I'm saying to them right now, I am for this marriage that you're in. Shouldn't have happened, and I will work with you to make it as good as it can possibly be. So not everybody clicks with that, but plenty do, and I think because of grace, we can have a very redemptive relationship. How should God's willingness to divorce in Jeremiah 3:8 affect our view of divorce? Well, we referred to that in an earlier question. I don't think God ever did divorce. The language of divorce in Jeremiah, I think, is used precisely to take it back. In other words, when he writes his wayward wife a, quote, bill of divorcement and sends her away into exile, he goes to get her. So I don't think God ever divorced his people. there was a legal separation of 70 years during which he punished his people. And the language of cutting off or ending the relationship was used only to take it back again to say, I'll never let you go. And it comes most clearly in Hosea, where the language is, I'm done with you. And then in chapter 11, my heart grows warm. How can I let you go, O Ephraim? So I think it should affect our view of divorce by saying God never divorces, and we shouldn't either if we can help. Not all Christians can stop a divorce from happening. I'm not going to lay that on every Christian. I'm dealing with a guy right now in our church. I spent an hour with him yesterday, and his wife is on him so hard for a divorce, and he doesn't want one, and he's wondering what to do, and it may go that way. You can refuse to sign the papers, and then it'll take 18 months instead of 3 weeks to get it done, but you can't stop divorce from happening in our culture if somebody wants it to happen bad enough. So I don't want to, when I say don't do it, I don't mean it won't happen to you. My parents are both believers and have been married 30 years. Recently, my mom moved out and is very bitter. What can I do to help them as a son? Well, I get that question every month or so after church, it seems like, recently. What can I do to help them as a son? Well, it's interesting that the mom moved out here and it's a son we're talking about, because that creates a special dynamic with the dad. And so lots of things can be done. The first thing I'm thinking about is pray, which is obvious. Oh God, humble them and open their hearts and make them willing to hear anything that I might say. Second, I don't know who's sinning here mainly. Did Dad drive her out with abuse, or did she leave an arrogant preference for another man? I don't know. So all those things are going to affect how he responds. But he would try to encourage his mom not to lose her faith, to be strong, to humble herself, to be willing to work through counseling. That is, try to get them both to pursue. Don't encourage their ongoing long-term separation, but encourage their efforts at reconciliation. And then, if he's old enough and he's strong enough, I think, to get in their face, get in Dad's face. Why did you do what you did? Or Mom, this isn't right. And try to point them to biblical truths, to Christ as the answer to their pain. And then to do it with submissive, humble, childlike, to say, Mom and Dad, you've reared me. I am who I am, and I'm heartbroken that this is happening to you. There's a spirit in which you go when you're going to do a kind of rebuking to a parent. There's a spirit of humility and lowliness that is possible.